What are you doing here?
Tell Daddy I'm not sick.
Pearl, enough. We are not doing this here.
Then where would you prefer I tell you these reports are false?
Excuse me?
This supposedly came from my classroom. I never wrote it.
Edward, Pearl has had a difficult week. Don't let this become another scene. She's already upset enough.
You came into my home, interrupted my rehearsal, and accused my fiancée of what exactly?
I accuse someone of lying about your daughter.
You've crossed the line. Leave.
No, Mr. Mercer.
Someone else crossed it. You're refusing to look.
Edward, let security handle this. Pearl's had enough.
Get her out!
Daddy, please.
I'll see you at school.
Welcome to Tales Through Time, where love is tested, secrets are exposed, and even broken hearts can find their way home.
Are you mad at me too?
Never. Why would I be mad at you?
Daddy said you shouldn't come anymore. The pink medicine makes me sleepy.
What pink medicine?
Ma'am, you cannot stand there either.
Apparently I can't stand inside either.
Have you completely lost your mind?
Possibly. Your security wouldn't let me in.
Because I told them not to.
Then you created this problem. This says Pearl had a violent episode in my classroom on March 17th.
And?
March 17th was a Saturday. And that is my signature.
What are you saying it?
I don't have to believe me, but for once, check before you decide everyone else is wrong.
Edward Mercer did not call Camille back. He did not apologize. And he certainly did not admit that she had shaken him. He simply remained in the driveway after her car disappeared beyond the gates, staring at one date printed near the top of a report. March 17th, a Saturday. Edward checked his phone, then his calendar. Then, because some stubborn part of him still needed Camille Brooks to be wrong, he opened Pearl's school calendar online. The campus had been closed. No classes, no special program, no student activities, nothing. Edward stared at the paper again. For almost a year, he had accepted documents like this without question. Because they were about Pearl, and Pearl was the one person in Edward's life capable of making fear stronger than logic. 3 years earlier, his wife Julia had died after a short illness. Pearl had been too young to understand why her mother had stopped coming home. Edward had understood too well. After Julia died, he became obsessed with protecting what remained. He double-checked school pickups, called doctors over minor symptoms, researched every teacher, every caregiver, every program. Edward Mercer had spent his adult life believing problems could be controlled if you gathered enough information and moved quickly enough. Then Kate Rowan entered his life. Kate did not tell Edward that he worried too much. That would never have worked. Instead, she made his worrying feel reasonable. When Pearl became quieter, Kate found a specialist. When Pearl struggled to stay awake one afternoon, Kate arranged an appointment. When school reports began describing poor concentration, emotional outbursts, and memory problems, Kate organized every document into folders. She knew the doctors, she knew the appointments, she knew which bottle was taken when. And Edward thanked her for loving his daughter. He did not notice that responsibility had slowly become delegation. That evening, Edward carried the report into his study and closed the door. He looked at every school document again. This time, without Kate beside him. 2 incidents supposedly occurred on weekends. Another report described an episode during a week Pearl had not even attended school. Edward called the school. No record existed of several events documented in his files. He called Camille's principal. The principal was careful, professional, and increasingly concerned. No, Camille had never reported Pearl as violent. No, the school had never classified Pearl as aggressive. Yes, teachers had noticed fatigue. Yes, Pearl had become quieter. But the frightening picture in Edward's private folder had not come from them. Edward ended the call. For the first time, he was no longer wondering whether Camille was wrong. He was wondering who had lied. Kate found him 20 minutes later. She leaned into the doorway. "You're hiding from your own rehearsal cleanup." Normally, Edward might have smiled. Instead, he closed the folder. "Long day." Kate crossed the room and kissed his forehead. "Come upstairs when you're done." Edward watched her leave. He almost asked her about the reports. Instead, he remembered Camille standing in his driveway. Check first. The next morning, Edward called Pearl's primary doctor himself. Not Kate. The doctor sounded surprised to hear from him. Edward hated that. He requested the original instructions connected to Pearl's current medications. One stood out. A pink liquid Pearl had been prescribed months earlier for occasional use when a particular symptom appeared. There was nothing sinister about it, nothing inherently dangerous when given properly, but the refill pattern did not match the doctor's instructions. Pearl appeared to have been receiving it far more often than intended. The doctor explained that frequent use could account for some of the very symptoms Edward had been told proved Pearl was deteriorating. Sleepiness, sluggishness, occasional fogginess. Edward hardly heard the rest. He remembered Pearl falling asleep during dinner, Pearl losing track of a sentence, Pearl pushing away a spoon and saying she did not want her medicine, and Kate answering gently, "It helps you, sweetheart." Then Edward saying, "Listen to Kate." 3 words. That afternoon, Edward came home early. He found Pearl in the sunroom drawing. Kate was upstairs. Edward sat beside his daughter. Pearl glanced at him, then returned to her picture. "What are you drawing?" "A house." Edward studied the crooked windows. "Who lives there?" Pearl pointed to one little figure. "Me." Then another. "Aunt Camille?" Edward swallowed. "And Daddy," Pearl thought. Then drew him outside the gate. Edward looked at the tiny crayon version of himself and felt something inside him give way. "Pearl, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "The pink medicine. Who gives it to you?" "Kate." "Every day?" "Most days." Edward's voice became quieter. "Did you ever tell me you didn't like it?" Pearl finally looked at him. "I told you." Not angry, not accusing, just factual. That made it worse. "I told you it makes my head sleepy." Edward could barely speak. "What did I say?" Pearl shrugged. "Kate said I dreamed it." And then Edward remembered. Pearl standing in his study doorway one evening in pajamas. Kate behind her, Pearl trying to explain something. Kate laughing gently and saying she had been confused after a dream. Edward kissing his daughter's forehead, sending her upstairs, never asking one more question. That night, Edward stopped reacting like a frightened father. He became the man who had built an empire by refusing to trust appearances. He ordered original medical records instead of summaries, asked his attorney for Julia's trust documents, had dates checked against calendars, requested archived security footage from the house, 14 reports. He read everyone twice, and within 48 hours, the story Kate had constructed began to collapse. The school reports were forged. Several specialist summaries exaggerated what doctors had actually said. Pearl's legitimate medicine had been given much more often than instructed, producing ordinary side effects that Kate later presented as signs of worsening illness. But none of that explained why. The answer was buried in Julia's trust. Julia had left a substantial fortune and a controlling interest in several family assets for Pearl. At 18, Pearl would assume significant control. But if Pearl were eventually declared incapable of managing those interests, control would remain with appointed trustees. Edward was already one. After his marriage, he had intended to add Kate. At the time, he had thought it romantic. A legal acknowledgement that she would not merely become his wife. She would also help protect Pearl. Then Edward found something else. Months before their engagement, Kate had already requested detailed information about that exact clause. Before Edward had proposed, before he had discussed adding her as a trustee, before she had any innocent reason to care. The security footage made the rest impossible to ignore. Pearl approaching Edward's study, Kate redirecting her. Pearl holding the pink bottle and shaking her head, Kate calmly leading her away. Pearl waiting outside Edward's office, Kate closing the door before she could enter. Nothing looked dramatic. Nothing looked violent. That was what horrified Edward most. Kate had not needed force. She had his trust. All she had needed to do was stand between Edward and Pearl long enough for him to stop noticing the distance. 2 nights later, Edward asked Kate to join him in the study. She entered smiling. The smile disappeared when she saw the documents spread across his desk. Edward stood near the window. "Sit down." Kate remained standing. "What is this?" Edward turned. "You tell me." Her eyes moved across the school reports, then the medical records, then Julia's trust. Something changed in her face. "Whatever Camille told you." "Camille never mentioned the trust." Kate stopped. Edward picked up one report. She didn't write this. Edward, Pearl is attached to Camille. That woman has been interfering for months. Edward placed another report beside the first. March 17th, Kate stared. It was a Saturday. Silence. Edward continued. This one describes an incident during a week Pearl wasn't at school. Kate folded her arms. Then somebody made a clerical error. One error is a mistake. Edward put a third report down. 14 become a pattern. He placed the medication instructions beside them. And this? Kate's expression tightened. I was helping her. You were giving her medicine more often than the doctor instructed. It was prescribed. That is not an answer. Pearl needed structure. She needed consistency. Edward's voice sharpened. She needed me to believe her. Kate changed tactics. Her expression softened. Edward, you know how vulnerable she has been since Julia died. I was the one holding everything together while you worked. I was the one at the appointments. I was the one managing the difficult days. Edward looked at her. You made the days difficult. Kate shook her head. That's ridiculous. You gave her something that made her tired, then used the tiredness as proof that she was getting worse. I was trying to make sure she qualified for long-term support. Edward looked down at Julia's trust. There it was, not a confession, but close. Long-term support. Kate realized too late what she had said. Edward stepped closer. Is that what you call this? She said nothing. You researched the incapacity clause before I proposed. I researched the family I was entering. You were not entering my family then. Kate's composure cracked. Do you know what it is like watching you hand everything to a child who may never understand what she owns? Edward became absolutely still. Kate continued. You were going to make me a trustee anyway. I would have been protecting her. Protecting her? His voice dropped. You were building a paper trail so one day you could prove she was incapable. Kate looked away, and that was enough. She had never needed Pearl seriously harmed. She only needed years of documentation, concerns, appointments, reports, symptoms. Enough paperwork that, when Pearl's inheritance became relevant, Kate could point backward and say, this child was never capable. Edward had watched the paper trail being built. Worse, he had helped validate it every time Pearl tried to tell him something was wrong. He walked to the study door and opened it. Kate stared at him. Our wedding is canceled. Edward, my attorneys already have copies of everything. You're going to destroy us because of a teacher? Edward looked at her. No. His voice was quiet now. I'm ending this because my daughter told me you were doing something that made her feel wrong, and you taught me not to believe her. Kate had nothing left to say. By evening, she was gone from the house. Edward's attorneys secured Pearl's trust immediately. The forged records were handed over for investigation. The school and doctors provided their originals. Kate lost access to Pearl. The wedding disappeared from the calendar, florists were canceled, guests were informed. Boxes of rehearsal decorations left the house. Edward watched every trace of Kate disappear and thought justice would feel bigger. It didn't. Because 3 days later, Pearl became unusually tired. By afternoon, she was dizzy. That evening, she could barely stay awake through dinner. Edward did not wait. He took her to the hospital. Doctors found no permanent damage and no new illness. They believed Pearl's body was experiencing temporary after effects from the prolonged pattern of receiving her medication more frequently than intended. With rest, hydration, monitoring, and proper care, they expected a full recovery. Edward should have felt relieved. Instead, he sat beside Pearl's bed, remembering every time she had tried to tell him. Camille arrived the following morning. Edward had not called her. The school had. Pearl was awake when Camille walked through the door. Her entire face changed. Aunt Camille. Camille crossed the room. Edward stood. Pearl barely looked at him. Camille noticed. Of course she noticed. Pearl improved quickly. The dizziness faded. Her appetite returned. Doctors repeatedly reassured Edward that there should be no lasting effects. Then the morning came for Pearl to leave the hospital. Edward crouched beside her. You ready to go home? Pearl turned toward the window. Edward tried again. We could get pancakes. Nothing. Or stop at the park. Pearl pulled her blanket closer. Edward looked toward Camille, who had come to say goodbye. Then, almost defeated, he said, I can take you to Aunt Camille's. Pearl turned immediately. Now. Edward felt the answer like a blow. Yes. Pearl climbed down from the bed. For the first time that morning, she willingly took his hand. Only because his hand led to Camille. That became the only promise Pearl consistently accepted. If Edward said they were going to Camille's, Pearl put on her shoes. If Camille was meeting them somewhere, Pearl agreed to go. So a few days later, Edward found himself standing outside Camille's townhouse with Pearl beside him. Camille opened the door. She looked at Pearl, then Edward. Edward cleared his throat. She wouldn't eat lunch. Camille raised an eyebrow. And? She said she might if she could see you. Camille stared at him. Interesting. Edward knew immediately where this was going. Camille, I seem to remember being escorted off your property. I remember very clearly. Do you? Painfully. Pearl looked between them. Aunt Camille, can we make grilled cheese? Camille smiled. Absolutely. Pearl hurried inside. Edward turned to leave. Camille stopped him. Edward, he looked back. You can come in. He seemed genuinely surprised. Don't misunderstand, you're still irritating. Edward's mouth twitched. I've been called worse. I've called you worse. I assumed you had. For the first time since the hospital, something in the air loosened. Edward sat at Camille's small kitchen table while Pearl talked almost entirely to Camille. He did not demand attention. He did not remind Pearl that he was her father. He simply listened. When they returned home, Pearl still would not let Edward read her bedtime story. But she said goodnight. He treated it like a gift. Edward did not become a different man overnight. He was still impatient, still accustomed to giving instructions, still capable of entering a room as though everyone should immediately adjust to him. But something fundamental had changed. Whenever Pearl spoke, Edward stopped. Even if he was on the phone, even if another adult was talking, even if what Pearl wanted to say seemed trivial, he stopped. Weeks later, Camille found Edward sitting alone outside her house, while Pearl played inside. Why aren't you in there? She asked me not to come in yet. Camille sat beside him. Edward stared ahead for a long moment, then spoke. I spent years believing that if I could control enough things, Pearl would be safe. I researched every school, every doctor, every person who came near her. Then the one person I trusted most used that certainty against me. Camille listened. Edward continued. I apologized to Pearl. I told her I was wrong. I told her Kate lied to me. But none of it seems to change anything. Camille looked at him. Because you're still making the apology about you. Edward frowned. That isn't what I'm doing. It is. The old Edward appeared for a second. Defensive. Proud. Then he stopped himself. Tell me what you mean. That mattered more to Camille than he realized. She answered honestly. You keep looking at Pearl and asking, even without saying it, when she's going to make you feel forgiven. But she isn't responsible for relieving your guilt. Edward looked away. She told you what was happening. You didn't listen. She loved you while you were not listening. That's why this hurts her so much. Edward's voice softened. What does she need from me? Not one apology. Camille looked directly at him. She needs to know that the next 100 times she tells you something, you will listen. Edward nodded slowly. No argument, no excuse, just acceptance. That night, he did not ask Pearl whether she forgave him. He asked what she wanted for dinner. Small things changed after that. Pearl began staying in the same room with him voluntarily. Then she let him help with homework. Then she sat beside him during a movie. Edward never celebrated those moments loudly. He had finally understood that trust returned quietly. The real test came months later at Pearl's school art exhibition. Each child had created a painting. Pearl had spent weeks on hers. That morning, it was missing. A teacher gently suggested Pearl might have forgotten to submit it. Pearl shook her head. I put it with the others yesterday. The teacher smiled kindly. Sometimes we remember things a little differently, sweetheart. Edward stood beside Pearl. Camille was across the room helping another student. She heard the conversation and looked over. Old Edward would have accepted the adult explanation. It was reasonable, convenient, efficient. Instead, Edward crouched until he was eye level with Pearl. "You're sure you put it there?" Pearl nodded. Edward held out his hand. "Then I believe you." Pearl stared at him. Edward continued. "Show me exactly where you left it, and we'll find out what happened." Camille stopped moving. Pearl took Edward's hand. 5 minutes later, they found the painting stacked accidentally with work from another class. A tiny mistake, nothing dramatic. Edward returned carrying it. Pearl stared at the painting, then at her father. Edward did not say, "I told you so," did not ask if she saw how much he had changed. He simply handed her the picture. Pearl wrapped both arms around his neck. Edward froze. It was the first time she had hugged him since the hospital. Then his arms closed around her. His eyes shut. He did not speak. Across the room, Camille looked away. Not because the moment hurt, because it belonged to them. When they left the school later, Pearl walked between Edward and Camille. She held Camille's hand first. Then, after several steps, she reached for Edward's too. Edward looked across Pearl at Camille. Camille smiled. That was enough. After that, Edward and Pearl did not become perfect. They became honest. Pearl disagreed with him. Edward listened. Sometimes he still said no. But now he explained why. Sometimes Pearl misunderstood something. Edward corrected her without making her feel foolish. And sometimes Edward was wrong. To the amazement of practically everyone who worked for him, Edward Mercer learned to say the sentence that had once seemed impossible. "I was wrong." Camille enjoyed that development, perhaps a little too much. Months later, Edward arrived at her house alone. Camille opened the door and immediately looked behind him. "Where's Pearl?" "With my sister." Camille narrowed her eyes. "Is she all right?" "She is perfectly fine." "Then why are you here?" For once, Edward looked uncertain. "I wanted to ask you to dinner." Camille stared. "We've had dinner many times." "With Pearl?" "Yes." Edward smiled. "I was hoping for dinner without Pearl." Camille folded her arms. "So this is not an emergency?" "No." "No forged reports?" "No." "No security guards?" "No." "No luxury car I have to stand in front of?" Edward closed his eyes. "I knew you would never let that go." "Never," he laughed. A real laugh. Camille had seen Edward furious, terrified, arrogant, heartbroken. She had watched him lose his daughter's trust and rebuild it slowly, without demanding that anyone reward him for trying. This Edward was different, not weak, not suddenly easy, just softer where it mattered. "So?" he asked. Camille made him wait. "One dinner," Edward exhaled. "I'll take it." Their relationship began there, not because Camille had rescued Pearl, not because Edward was wealthy, and not because Pearl needed another mother. Camille was very clear about that. Pearl already had a mother. Julia remained part of her story. Camille never tried to replace her. Pearl loved her as Aunt Camille. That was enough. Edward learned to love Camille separately from what she had done for his daughter. He loved the woman who challenged him when everyone else deferred. The woman who looked at his gates and decided that if he would not let truth come inside, she would wait in his driveway. Almost a year later, the Mercer Children's Foundation held a garden fundraiser. Pearl ran between tables with other children, laughing loudly. Healthy, confident, impossible to ignore. Edward stood beside Camille watching her. "There was a time," he said, "when I would have received a 3-page report explaining why that noise was concerning." Camille laughed. "There was a time I nearly let your driver run me over." The car was fully stopped. "My version is better." "Your version is fraudulent. That word has history in this family. Be careful." Edward smiled, then grew serious. "Camille," she looked at him. "For most of my life, I thought protecting people meant knowing what was best before they did." Camille waited. "I thought love gave me the right to decide quickly, to take control, to remove uncertainty." His gaze moved toward Pearl. "I nearly lost my daughter because I was so determined to protect her that I stopped hearing her." Camille's expression softened. Edward took her hand. "You taught me something I should have learned long before you stood in front of my car." "What?" "That listening is not surrender." He reached into his jacket. Camille stopped smiling. Edward held a ring between them. He did not kneel yet. I don't need you to become anything for Pearl. Camille's eyes filled. She already knows exactly who you are to her. Aunt Camille. Forever, apparently. I can live with that. Edward smiled. This is for me. Then he lowered himself to one knee. Would you marry a man who occasionally requires extraordinary intervention before he understands the obvious? Camille laughed through her tears. Occasionally? Edward glanced toward Pearl. Pearl had seen them. Her eyes widened. She started running toward them. Edward looked back at Camille. I'm improving. You are? Is that a yes? Pearl reached them before Camille answered. Is Aunt Camille staying? Camille looked at Pearl, then at Edward, and finally at the man who had once believed that loving his daughter meant speaking for her. Now he waited. He did not answer for Camille. He simply waited for her answer. Camille smiled. Yes. Pearl squealed and wrapped herself around Camille. Edward stood and pulled them both close. He had once believed the greatest danger to his family was something he had failed to control. He eventually learned the truth. The greatest danger had been his certainty that he could never be wrong. Pearl had told him the truth. Camille had told him the truth. He had dismissed them both. And the woman he once ordered out of his home had eventually taught him the lesson that saved it. Sometimes the people we love do not need us to decide for them. They do not need us to explain what they meant. They do not need us to speak louder. Sometimes they simply need us to stop and listen.